I have no problem with the medical use of cannabis, just as I have no problem with the medical use of opiates. If a drug is needed for a valid medicinal purpose, though, and is being administered safely, there should be no question of its legality. And if a drug that's proven to be safe abroad is needed here, it should be available. I agree that the regulation of medicines is a thicket of complexity, bureaucracy and corporate and institutional self-interest. My basic contention is that something that's been found to be safe in a reliable jurisdiction shouldn't need to be tested again here.
Marijuana is a gateway drug. The risk of graduating to ice or to heroin from extended marijuana use is real and documented. This action by the Greens risks the health of Australians. It should be rejected and they should withdraw it, and we will oppose it.
Herb is a plant. I mean, herbs are good for everything. Why these people who want to do so much good for everyone, who call themselves governments and this and that, why them say you must not use the herb? Because it make you rebel. Against what?
Excuse me while I light my splay. Oh God, I got to take a leave from reality. I just can't dream. As a while staying with this way.
Hello, today is the 14th of November 2018, and you're listening to the Australian Cannabis Review podcast. Hey, thanks for joining me again this week. We're going to continue on our theme for November, which is talking about medicinal cannabis stocks listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Now, if you're new to the podcast, well, why are we talking about cannabis stocks on a cannabis podcast? Well, it's kind of related because, well, very much so related actually, because all the biggest movers and shakers in this space are publicly listed companies, and a lot of these companies have also got deals and partnerships with other major cannabis companies around the world who are also publicly listed. So it's very much something that is on point and on topic. So last week we covered Cann Group, and if you haven't listened to last week's podcast, I encourage you to do so. There's some really interesting information about the company. I think as a company that you can invest in, they're probably up there alongside some of the top, 3 to 5 listed companies on the Australian Stock Exchange. I'd probably put them in my top 2 or 3. Now, it's a whole other thing if you should invest in that company right now. This is an emerging industry. Everything I say here is just for educational and entertainment purposes. If you do wish to invest, just be sure to know that this is a new and emerging industry. There's a lot of risks at stake. A lot of these companies aren't really making any serious revenue as of yet. But, the government only changed legislation on this a few years ago, and it's expanding slowly. So even over the last kind of few years, there has been slow progress. But if you see what's happening in Canada at the moment, well, just over 3 weeks ago, they legalized cannabis for recreational use. So you never know if the Australian government, by any chance that could happen, which I personally don't think would be happening too soon, but if it did, it would really drive the share price of these companies. But Cann Group, who I talked about last week, they're pretty financially solid. They've got a really good plan. So once again, I invite you to listen to that podcast if you wish. But for this week, we're talking about AusCann. Now, they're the second largest company by market cap in Australia, and by market cap in the medical cannabis space, that is, not in all the companies on the ASX. And AusCann, so they're an Australian-based company, because some of these companies are based, overseas, but they're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. But AusCann is Australian-based, and their aim is to produce and provide high-quality, economical, and clinically validated cannabinoid medicines to Australian patients. And they're particularly targeting medicines for neuropathic and chronic pain. So, what else do we want to know about AusCann? Well, They first started off in the year 2014. Back then they were a private company, and in 2016 they started procedure to do a reverse takeover of a company called TW Holdings, who were listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So this is a kind of common process or procedure that companies can undertake to list themselves on the stock exchange. Other ways they can do is do an initial public offering, but that's another option. They didn't do that. They went through the route of reverse takeover, where they signed an agreement with TW Holdings, and TW Holdings changed their ticker code, and the company TW Holdings kind of ceased to exist, and AusCann became that company. And the whole, business outlook of what TW Holdings were about has changed to now a medicinal cannabis focus. Now, even before AusCann listed officially on the ASX under their ticker code AC8, they had already signed a strategic agreement with Canopy Growth Corporation. Now, I've mentioned Canopy Growth a few times. They're currently the second largest cannabis company in the world, but when they signed this agreement in May of 2016, Canopy Growth was the largest cannabis company in the world at that point in time. And a fun Canopy Growth fact is that their headquarters has actually been a converted Hershey's chocolate factory somewhere in Ontario, Canada. So that's a fun fact. But back to the overview of AusCann and the Canopy Alliance. Canopy agreed to issue a 15% stake in AusCann, and they have another option to acquire a further 5% within a 3-year time frame. So right from the get-go, AusCann had an alliance with a really strong strategic partner. It's something that's happened with Cann Group, who I talked about last week, where they have an agreement with Aora, and they own around 22% of Cann Group. So as we can see, the top 2 Australian medicinal cannabis companies in Australia have an interest from the Canadian market, and they're really interested to see what's going to unfold on the Australian market, and they want to be first movers in this space, and understandably so, because this market's got a lot of potential money to be made in it. Now, some other exciting news for AusCann was that they're also trading not just on the Australian Stock Exchange, but also on an exchange called the US OTCQX market. Now, you're probably asking, what the frig is this OTCQX market? Well, it's just like any other market. You've got the Australian Stock Exchange, you've got the New York Stock Exchange. This is just another market where traders can buy and sell AusCann stocks. And the great thing about this is that it increases the exposure with global investors. So it kind of promotes the stock to US investors. It gives a chance to diversify the shareholder base of AusCann, and it enhances the access and liquidity of the company's stock. So, there's 3 other companies that list on the ASX that are also trading on OTC markets. And one of them is AusCann, who we talked about last week, and 2 other companies who are really kind of up there in the medicinal cannabis space in Australia. And that is Elixinol Global and Zelda Therapeutics, but we'll get into more detail about them in another podcast. Now, if you want to learn more about the OTCQX marketplace, just Google OTC Market Group and you can find out a lot more information about that. But the QX platform, which AusCann is trading on, is kind of the top tier of the 3 marketplaces for over-the-counter trading of stocks. So, you can't be like a penny stock trading on this. You can't be a shell company trading on this, where it's kind of just a upfront company, but there's really nothing behind it. If a company's been bankrupt before, they can't trade on the OTCQX. They're disqualified. So, there are kind of stringent regulations and kind of criteria for companies to trade on this platform. So it's kind of a really good place for them to be. It gives them exposure and so forth. Now, AusCann has also been really focused on developing some partnerships with other companies, not just with Canopy Growth Corporation, who probably is the biggest ticket item for them having an investment in. They're also working with Murdoch University. They've signed an alliance with them where they're working on researching different strains of cannabis, looking at cultivation and development of medicinal cannabis strains for the effective treatment of various medical conditions. And I believe that will really help AusCann's business plan, because they've also signed up a joint venture with a Chilean-based medicinal cannabis group called Fundación Daya. Now, Fundación Daya and AusCann formed a 50-50% joint venture, and that company is called AusCann. Now, the purpose of AusCann is on becoming South America's leading medicinal cannabis company. And AusCann plans to, or they have already planted crops. They've harvested these crops. I think they've harvested over about 1.5 ton of crops, which isn't really a huge amount, but that crop can also be used for, research purposes as well. So it's just another form of potential revenue making for the company as well. So now, going on from that, because AusCann want to be a manufacturer of medicinal cannabis pharmaceutical products, they're going to need someone to distribute that. And they've done exactly that. They've already signed a heads-on agreement early on in 2018 with Australia's leading wholesale distributor, and they're called the Australian Pharmaceuticals Industries Limited. Now, the agreement between API and AusCann kind of helps AusCann's strategy in its supply chain, and it provides an extensive distribution network and access to already established infrastructure for the company. Furthermore, in June of 2018, AusCann also entered an agreement to accelerate their Australian manufacturing operation. So there hasn't been really too much talks about this operation, but currently what has been announced is that they've signed into an R&D agreement with Jade Cannabis. Now, what Jade Cannabis will do for AusCann, they will undertake research and development work in their facility in Canada. The announcement says that it's for an initial 3-year period, but the research aims at increasing yields in their grow rooms, which will result in more cost-effective cannabinoid pharmaceuticals for AusCann patients. So, they're really trying to get the whole supply chain covered. And by having the whole supply chain covered, it kind of covers AusCann's basis. They don't have to rely on other companies now to, supply them with cannabis. They've got their own people researching cannabis. They've got the distribution end covered as well. So, kind of by having everything covered in that space, plus they've also got Cannabis Growth, who I mentioned, and they've got access to their information and their expertise. So it's really showing that the company has a really holistic view of what they're doing. They've got really good people working for them as well. Their CEO, or their managing director, should I say, Elaine Darby, she's going to step down from the board, and they're going to look for somebody to be a suitable candidate to take the company even further. Now, you might be wondering, okay, so they've got all this planned, but do they have the money for it? Well, yes, they do. They did a capital raising early on in the year where they raised $33.4 million from institutional and sophisticated investors in North America and Australia at $1.10 per share, and then they also raised an additional $8 million from a share purchase plan, so just to your regular mum and dad investors, where they raised an additional $8 million at $1.05 per share. So at present, AusCann has about $47 million in their bank account at the moment, which is enough to fund a lot of their activities for the future. Now, another successful thing for the company that happened, because their share price kind of has fallen a bit since that capital raising. Right now it's sitting at about 80 cents per share, and even at the end of October, so just very recently, it fell to 64 cents per share. So the share price has had a bit of a tumble. As we know, this is a kind of very fluctuating market. Shares can move up or down very quickly depending on kind of the news flow that comes out. And a really good example of that is in August, when they announced a successful pilot study of their final dose cannabinoid capsules. Their share price rose from 81.5 cents per share to closing the day at $1.08 per share. So that's 32.5% rise in its share price. Now, the good thing about that announcement was that AusCann announced to the market that they'd completed a successful pilot study of its optimal final dose for its cannabis-based medicines. Now, this study that they'd been doing had been carried on for the past 10 months, and they hope to release these medicines in the first half of 2019. So, already from next year, they're probably expected to be making revenues from selling these medicines. At least that's what the company hopes as well. Then, the share price kind of slowly retreated a bit. But then a month later, when AusCann announced when they announced that they were trading on the US OTCQX market, which I talked about before, on that day, the share price finished up 16.1 cents to $1.08 per share. And then, as time's gone on by, it's fallen to the 64 cent mark at the end of October. And at the beginning of the month, it was trading at 99 cents per share. So it lost about a third of its price over the month. And then kind of over the last week and a bit, it's up again about 20%. So it is really fluctuating, but these, I believe, are long-term investments. It's a company that, I think if you're holding for like 5 or 10 years, then it's probably a stock worth buying. Because when they had that capital raising for its institutional investors at $1.10 per share, well, the price now is down to 80 cents. So that's a 30% discount right there. If you're going to hold for that time, it's definitely worth it. Currently, the market cap for the company is about $250 million, rather, I should say. And is that a fair market cap? Well, they've got investment from Canopy Growth Corporation. If legislation in Australia changes, it could be worth a lot more. I mean, Canopy Growth Corporation is worth upwards, I forget the numbers off my head now, but around $12-14 billion. And they're not really having an increase in revenue. And Canada's population is no more than kind of 40-50% larger than Australia's. So if that's anything to go by, then geez, this stock could really get flying in the future. And if you look at the chart of Canopy Growth Corporation, well, you can just see how far the share price has risen over the last few years. So I think as a long-term investment, with some of these major companies around the world invested in or having at least a stake in the company, I think it's something to really consider. So, and I feel like I kind of am banging on and really trying to promote these stocks, but I'm just trying to provide information, what's out there in the medicinal cannabis space, what these companies are doing. If you want to learn more, just have a read online into further detail into their announcements. I mean, I'm just giving a brief overview of, who they're dealing with, a little bit of their history, and, maybe at the end of the day, you want to make an investment in this as well. Am I invested in any of these companies? Well, yeah, so I kind of do have a self-interest, but I remember going back to, a while back, and having a chat with my friend and saying, we should do something to legalize cannabis. And it was a stupid idea when we were only teenagers, and that was over a decade ago. But now it's legalized for medicinal purposes, and we can buy a plane ticket to Canada and smoke it legally there. And over a decade ago, that didn't seem feasible, but it's something that's possible now. So I just think it's a really exciting space. That's kind of why I'm talking about it. There is the medicinal side of it too, but I think deep down there's a kind of an end game, and that is to make it legal for recreational purposes. And I don't agree that everyone should be taking or smoking cannabis. It's a free choice. It's just like, not everyone should or has to drink alcohol. It should be an option up to the individual. But I think it's bloody ridiculous and stupid that this stuff is illegal and has been illegal for so long. And it's also criminalized, where people, get records. It affects their lives. It affects their future job prospects and everything that goes along with that. So, no, that's why I'm kind of here, supporting it, promoting it. And yeah, I find what these companies are doing is pretty interesting. Not just in Australia, but also around the world. So, yeah, that's the podcast for today. That's my little summary at the end. If you want to learn more, go to cannabisontheasx.com. That's the website I've got up and running with kind of all the up-to-date information about, the announcements. So you can look at all the ASX stocks that are in the medicinal cannabis sphere, and, you can find information on them. I've kind of got a succinct summary. I've got links where you can look up their announcements. Plus, I've got some other articles just kind of explaining the industry. I've got like monthly wrap-ups. There's also other details about, who gives out the licenses and everything like that. Oh, and that's one thing I forgot to mention in this podcast about AusCann, is that they've also got all the licenses. They've got the growing licenses, the cultivation licenses, the manufacturing licenses. So once again, they've got that field covered. Well, all right. So I guess that's me for the week. Hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Like I said, visit the website. You don't want to visit the website. You can just listen to some brief information and an overview from me. Or if you want to view other sources, just type in AusCann into Google, or AC8 space ASX into Google, and you'll get plenty of information. You just have to rely on me. I think when it comes to this stuff, don't just rely on one person. I'm just a dude sitting in a room. I might know a little bit more than you, and I might know a little bit less than you, but either way, find out through multiple sources, inform yourself, educate yourself, and make the best decision for yourself. That's what it comes to at the end of the day. Just don't be a cunt or a dickhead at the end of the day either. That pretty much sums it up, right? A quote from Jim Jeffries. Just do what you want, but don't be a cunt. Yeah, so that's me. That's the podcast for the week. Kind of just ad-libbed a bit there. Spun some shit at the end, but I think it's a bit worthwhile and made the podcast a bit more real. So, you've been listening to the Australian Cannabis Review. Hope you join me next time. Bye-bye.